Right? The court like gave you seeds and you can trade seeds with their king. It's
for
sovereign
what?
debt. They issue sovereign debt.
Okay, yes. Let me put it that way.
They're financiers.
For arms. And it's for arms.
Oh my God, it's sovereign debt issued for military expansion.
This is what I was saying. Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of Pop Cultural Marxism, a podcast from the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. If you enjoy what we're doing and want to consider supporting us, we do have a Patreon accessible via the Brooklyn Institute website. If you join at any level, you get access to tons of content from this podcast, from our sister podcasts, as well as recordings from the Brooklyn Institute, events, panels, talks, and a whole host of other things.
Yeah.
Today, we will be talking about Zelda Tears of the Kingdom.
The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom.
Oh, is that the? Is that,
yeah.
Is this one of these, like, is the title Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark or Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Yeah, exactly.
But before we do, it's been a while since we've convened.
How you
Hello,
doing?
you've been in like a real writing hole.
Yeah, it's funny. Normally we do a big news segment up front about like things happening in the world of pop culture, which I think we'll touch on a few things. But yeah. We sort of took a couple of months there to finish up a manuscript, get it in, and now am in the arduous process of revising it over the next month or so. So not a lot of cultural consumption other than what we are talking about today.
Yeah, likewise. I have been busy teaching courses, most recently on architecture and on puppets and automata, which has been a lot of fun.
And very relevant for today's discussion.
Pop culturally, I have not done too much. I saw the new Wes Anderson film recently.
How was that?
You know, I think we've talked about this. I have, like you, a kind of mixed relationship with his films. I think that I liked it more than I thought I would because it has some of the strangeness and darkness of some of his earlier work.
Oh, cool.
It was in some ways a nice return to form.
Yeah, I'm always torn between him as this kind of like, he's real hacky in his like his framing. Everything is symmetrical and right. It's such a shtick. But then at the same time, some of the earlier movies, I was thinking, especially of Royal Tenenbaums, is one that like I still find so moving. It somehow gets me.
I like Grand Budapest Hotel a whole lot, and I think that's because his style is the abruptness with which that film comes to an end and the sort of darkness like undergirding the whole thing makes his style more interesting. Like his style is more interesting.
Right. It like punches through.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then like everyone else, I've been half-heartedly consuming discourse on the upcoming summer blockbusters or recently released summer blockbusters. Which we will at some point this summer invariably talk about. Your Indiana Joneses, your Barbies, your Oppenheimers, I just saw the Napoleon trailer.
Oh, I have yet to see the Napoleon trailer. Mark and I were talking earlier, Mark, the BISR programming director, about how much Oppenheimer has sort of reopened in this very fascinating way all these like historical debates about the bomb.
I mean, that's what I'll be interested to talk about. Because I mean, spending my early life in Japan and then only much later when I came to the States realizing exactly what students here were taught.
Well, that's so funny. Like before you were in the office today, I was in with a bunch of other folks and was like, it turned out I was the only one, I guess, who'd gone to American public school. And I was like, yo, we were taught, like if you wrote on a test, like it would have cost more lives. Like the atom bomb didn't save lives or something like that. Like you would be failed. Like it would be marked incorrect, like historically inaccurate.
Wait, so if you wrote
what is not the sort of mainline American
I see.
history position, which is that like the bomb saved lives.
Oh, yes,
it
yes,
didn't
yes.
save both American and Japanese lives. Counterintuitive,
Right.
If you were to like, that was what you were taught in class, and to claim anything otherwise, you would be marked wrong. At least
Right.
in my experience. I'm not going to say all high schools, but I went to a really nice public high school. So I'm like, if that was true for me, that must have been true for most folks.
That's wild. No, I will be very morbidly and disappointedly curious to see it and then to talk about it.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan is too big of a category to hit in a quick news segment.
And he really is a category. In the same way that James Cameron is a category. Oh, that's the other pop cultural phenomenon. The fucking submersible. I did not.
Oh my God, yes, Izzy, this is like so your jam. I can't believe we didn't even think of this for the show.
I cannot believe, if you had told me when we were recording Avatar that James Cameron would emerge later in the year as the unexpected reasonable voice in public
But
discourse.
also as like the talking head expert.
And but like actual expert.
No, I know he knows this shit. Yeah.
So as you all probably know, this year's version of the I suppose this year's version of the Ever Given boat stuck in canal was a bunch of a handful of people. The CEO of this company, Ocean. What is it? Ocean.
I don't
Ocean
remember.
Gate. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ocean Gate.
By the way, all the emails they revealed after like that, where he's like, where like some safety engineer is like, I really don't think this is going to work. And he's like, my whole life, people have been telling me things don't work.
So, it has kind of all of the elements of a good story. It has this sort of like,
his hubris is punished. It's
the hubris
Greek.
that's punished. The hubris, the investigative journalism component, the bit where everyone learns about what carbon fiber is made of.
It's Icarus and all the President's Men rolled into one.
The part that absolutely killed me is that the wife of this Ocean Gate CEO is the descendant of the Strausses, which many people will know as the old couple in Titanic.
Wait, what?
Ida Strauss and her husband, who I know. He was the CEO of Macy's. They both died on the Titanic, and this woman, the wife of the Ocean Gate CEO, is their descendant.
I don't even know what to do with this information.
Right.
Like, it's just like, this is also something that came up during the sort of like pre-show, like earlier in the day, about the Oppenheimer stuff, where it's just like, because it is so intense, like these sea disasters are so intense. The bomb, though, is like so intense that everything around it just becomes like, you cannot believe it is true, right? It all feels like it is. I mean, it's cliche to say, truth is stranger than fiction. But here it's more like the true storylines like mimic the logic of fictional storylines.
Exactly. To a point that it is unbelievable. Like if you wrote this as fiction, it would be written off as too easy.
Yeah, and I don't want to get deep into the nuclear stuff because A, it's much darker than what we're talking about today, and B, but we're going to probably hit it hard at some point.
Right. It's also
hard and more seriously.
Right. I was going to say, it's also, unlike the submersible, not funny.
I agree. Actually, there was like this weird like internet thing about like, why are you so like lacking in empathy for these like poor people? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, they're my enemies. Like,
it's objectively,
I guess, like as humans, it is sad, but like it is somehow much more sad than when like, yes, like what was the famous case in South America where like all the I forget what country it was, all the miners were, Chilean miners were trapped. That was like, in some way, to my mind, objectively sadder.
Right. Right. And the in Thailand, the boys who were trapped in the cave is an objectively better rescue story.
Yes, good point.
But this was, I mean, it was funny.
Yeah, it is funny. Okay.
Well, having established that today we will be talking about Zelda Tears of the Kingdom.
Yes. The Legend.
I'm sorry,
of Zelda.
the Legend of Zelda.
I hate to
Tears
keep
of the
doing this.
Kingdom.
It's just I actually think that the phrasing here is indicative of of the way in which they design. Yeah.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Are they all the Legends of Zelda?
They all are.
Okay,
and
so
the original game was just called The Legend of Zelda.
Okay, so what you should know about this game is that I had never played any Zelda prior to this title, and knew nothing about it as a cultural phenomenon, except that the people I know who had played it had a great, deep, abiding love for it. Many of those people played in childhood. It's an object of childhood nostalgia in a whole host of ways. But I had coming into this game, I had no prior conceptions whatsoever.
Yeah, and I'm pretty much the dead opposite. So I played the original Legend of Zelda on the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System in whatever year, like 1986. Actually, I don't have this in my notes. And I don't think I've played. There are 19 entries, I believe. Not including, maybe that's including, but I'm not sure if that's including also like spin-offs, of which there are many. So yeah, that's about as different as possible.
So by way of introduction, maybe it's helpful for me to ask then how you would situate this game sort of, and perhaps its paired title, Breath of the Wild, which we can talk about a little bit. How you would situate these two games kind of in the history of Zelda games generally, both in terms of its sort of narrative style, but also its actual mechanics.
Sure, that's actually it's a bigger question than I expected this early, but yeah, the original so it's interesting to think about these last two, right? Tears of the Kingdom that we're talking about today, and Breath of the Wild, this is a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild. This has not happened in most of the Zelda games. So the only other one I think is, there's a couple. There's Ocarina into the Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, into the Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask. That's a direct sequel. Although pretty disconnected. I'm looking at our producers. See, the story is disconnected, but it's still a sequel. I'm trying to think if there are. Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. Although Zelda 2 is like the redheaded stepchild of the series. It plays and looks nothing like. Why is that funny?
No, I'm learning all of this for the first time.
Oh yeah. So like Zelda 2 is like a more ramped up RPG version of Zelda, and it's just unlike any of the other games. And it's not, I have to admit, I think it's not very fun. It's a little bit weird. But for the most part, Zelda games have been a mainstay of sort of the Nintendo's, offerings for a long time, right? Nintendo is very well known for iterating and having these extremely well-known IPs and franchises, right? To a degree that is actually not comparable. Like, so if you were thinking of something like Nintendo and Mario, or Nintendo and Pikachu and Pokemon, things like that, those things are like more recognizable than any other game IPs in the world. So like the equivalent for the quote unquote big three of gaming, right? For Microsoft, be something like Master Chief, which is just it's not even remote. And for Sony, be something like Kratos, or again, it's just not to that level of recognition. That something like Mario, I think Mario was more recognizable than Mickey Mouse for a while. Like we're talking about levels where it's like you're just under like the cross and the crescent moon in terms of symbolic recognition. In any case, right? Zelda, though, has always been in that sort of group, but it was not always the most popular game. I was making this joke to Izzy earlier. It sort of like has almost like it's not so unpopular as to be the Velvet Underground of major commercial gaming, but it has that sort of effect where it is much more recognized as like for its like technical and design achievements by other by a lot of players, but by a lot of designers. So, for example, the first Legend of Zelda, the 8-bit one, was the first console game to have saving in it. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, alongside Mario 64 on the N64, basically designed or shaped how all controls would work for three-dimensional characters in three-dimensional worlds. And Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild in particular, it's funny to me because it's both a return to form, because the original Zelda was a kind of open world game. So like, in some sense, it's like a throwback. But in some sense, it really redefined like what an open world can be. And that's something we'll get into, I think, in our discussion of Tears of the Kingdom in more detail. And a couple other things to say here. So the initial series was created by Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. And the more recent titles since Ocarina of Time have been under the direction of Eiji Aonuma, who's sort of a protege of Miyamoto's, and Hidemaro Fujibayashi, who, fun fact, used to be a game park designer. And one of the things that is really interesting about Nintendo...
Do you mean theme park designer?
What did I say?
Game park?
Yeah, theme park designer. Oh, my God. Nintendo is a very old company. I think people are often surprised to learn it's like those German beer companies. You find out they were like founded in like 1300 or something, right?
Shit! It really is old.
Yeah. Oh, you just looked it up. Yeah, Nintendo was founded in 1889 as a Hanafuda, a trading card company. Hanafuda is a Japanese. It's like a quasi-gambling Japanese game. And it was the only one... Well, I'm not going to get into the history of Hanafuda, for fuck's sake. But basically, like, that's old, right? And in fact, the trajectory of Nintendo very much follows the trajectory of Japanese modernization, which is, right, like, the initial ownership and sort of company sort of is handed over from a, like, feudal family into this more modern thing, and then run very much like a sort of a Japanese pyramidal style corporation for most of its existence. However, there's a couple like quirky things about it. So A, is very old. It's gone through ups and downs. In particular, Nintendo suffered its first sort of big setback with World War II, because the government was not, surprisingly, in that period, not so into sort of public recreation and gambling and things like that, which is what Nintendo specialized in that era. But also, Nintendo lived through the famous... there's sort of been two giant phases of video game development. And the first one, it's almost forgotten in Western imagination, even though it's like not that long ago. It's something that really fascinates me. The first iteration of games came up, I believe, they were arcade stuff, and it was in like the late 60s, early 70s, and it was very much associated as an adult entertainment. You would find it in like arcade games in bars, and that then translated into home consoles like the Atari 2600 and things like that. And there was a massive crash out in this market because of overproduction. And the sort of last man standing was Nintendo, who cautiously basically rebuilt the game industry. Basically the NES, the reason it's called an entertainment system and not a games thing, right? And in Japan, it was called a Famicom, the family computer, was to dissociate it as much as possible from this previous crash game market. And the other thing that the sort of Nintendo history that's important is that they have a weird business model. I often jokingly call it like quasi-mercantile, but they're capitalist. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're nice. So I don't want people to mistake that. But like they certainly punch above their weight class. So right, they are a massive market share of global video games. And it's actually been very funny in the trials and sort of ups and downs of Microsoft trying to buy Activision. A lot of the agencies have had to try to define Nintendo out of the market, which actually makes some sense and also doesn't. They're trying to do that such that it's mostly a Microsoft Sony as like a paired comparison, and to highlight Microsoft's daunting market share in general, which it is, right? So Microsoft, I have like a list of market cap somewhere, but Microsoft's one of the biggest companies in the world. Nintendo is like not tiny by any stretch of the imagination, but it's in like the 200 and 300s. It is dramatically smaller than these other companies. And it does a very weird thing, right? Most companies proceed through one of two strategies, either like an ultra debt-fueled growth strategy. So think of Amazon is like the classic model here, right? Amazon didn't turn a profit till, I don't know, 10 years into its existence or something like that. Or a like profit-driven, but then investment strategy, right? So you're like generating profits, but you're constantly spending them to grow the business, right? So it's like growth and profitability are always this kind of relationship. Nintendo does always chase after this kind of, what's the word? They always want to be profitable, but so that they can basically store up giant piles of cash. The amount of cash on hand that Nintendo has would look irrational to basically almost any other company in the world. And they do this for two things. One, if there's a product failure or a market crash, of which they've experienced many, you get by. Two, it allows them to avoid the vicissitudes of like having to always have, speaking of summer blockbusters, having to always have a blockbuster every season. And it allows you to do things like spend 6 years. Like that's actually not a unusual development time in modern gaming, but it is an unusual development time if you already are building on a template of a map that you've already had. And that's part of where the magic is here. I think probably I should hold off on more Nintendo data, although there's lots of fun facts about the sort of history of the series and the creators and things like that we can get into.
Interesting. And sort of Nintendo as a corporation, I mean, they're kind of co-produced, I think, Super Mario Brothers film is like the highest grossing film of this year or something like that.
And in fact, that movie and I think their new theme park division, speaking of theme parks again, is their first real like, and this is, they're like weirdly like both experimental, like they'll take a lot of risks in their game design, but also very conservative, right? When it comes to like business practice, they're very protective of IP. They're very litigious. They're much more litigious than these other companies. It's sort of rational because, right, if your IP is more valuable, you're going to be very litigious about it. But yeah, the movie and the theme parks are actually like amongst their first like real forays into like side business, like other than like merch. Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, within Nintendo, right, which has, you know, as you've just explained, this sort of long and interesting history as a company, Zelda 2 seems to have, you know, a kind of very storied history within the company. It's sort of developed in many iterations. It's gone through a number of changes aesthetically, narratively. So maybe I suppose I want to sort of ask you to talk a little bit about that, about kind of the history and evolution of this particular property.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really, really, really interesting because, again, the original Legend of Zelda is one of the things, I think we even talked about this on the Elden Ring episode, like things like Ultima. Like there were old games that sort of anticipated or even just did the open world thing before that was like a term. But very quickly in the Zelda series, the other thing I should say, and this will come up, I think, on our next conversation, is that the creators of this game, so Miyamoto and Tezuka, and then their subsequent Aonuma and Fujibayashi, and there's so many other folks, could not agree on what genre of game they were making. And this is, I think, very important, something we'll come back to. So,
and also something that I think like reflects, it says something interesting about how insistently a lot of kind of gaming commentary, or it says something about how insistently a lot of kind of commentators look to genre categories, right?
Yes.
As a way of sort of distinguishing games, whereas it seems like there's more porousness or something even within.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like fair to call it like an action adventure role playing game, at least the classics. But again, Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the most famous game designers of the world, right, and one of the makers of the series, is like, absolutely not. It's an action adventure. It's not an RPG. And like, I don't really want to get too deep into that, but it is fascinating because there is always this question. Something that has lasted is always this sort of like stacking of different systems and different interplays. But after the original Legend of Zelda and then Zelda 2, which I said is a little bit of a weird one, you eventually get things like A Link to the Past, which I think first introduces the basic formula that you will now recognize from Tears of the Kingdom, which is that like the 4 sort of elemental dungeons and things like that. And this really gets solidified with the first 3D entry, which is Ocarina of Time. And I already mentioned that for its sort of like technical achievement, but it really was also like a pinnacle of design for that kind of like dungeon stuff. I will say, and this is a little like heretical for people who are really into games like I am, but I actually don't think Ocarina holds up that well like today. Like I would actually, if you want to play like a good Ocarina style game, I would actually suggest something like Twilight Princess from the Wii. But that's neither here or there. And it became very much this sort of like hub and spoke model. So, right, you would have a central hub like Hyrule Field, and then you go to the dungeon, then you go to the next dungeon, and each one of these games, again, there are 19 games in this series, for a long time between Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword, which I forget what year Skyward Sword is, but it's a lot of games in there, all follow that formula. And in fact, Skyward Sword is probably the most intense version of that, at least in the terms of like, it's like the whole game is that formula. And like, the world is like a puzzle, like a line of puzzles up to the thing, and then you solve the thing, and then a line of puzzles, and you solve the thing. And then it really does change dramatically with this sort of changing of the guard in some ways. Like with Breath of the Wild, Aonuma and oh god, I'm keep fucking his name up, Fujibayashi, really sort of went back to the drawing board and recreated, again, both going forward, but also recreating the genre of the open world game with Breath of the Wild and then Tears of the Kingdom. There's lots of other like fun facts and things that one can say about this. One I will mention that I think is very important because it'll set us up for some of the things later is contemporary aesthetics we often talk about affective qualities, like this sort of affective turn is still a big thing, right? Zelda is one of the few games I can think of where the initial creator, so Miyamoto in this case, wanted it to capture, it was based not on a specific game mechanic or a specific story to be told, but rather on a feeling. And the feeling is something like, again, I'm paraphrasing him, but it's like the feeling that a child might have getting lost or wandering in a garden or a forest and imagining that their stick is a sword. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And there's something, I don't know if you've kind of seen, like videos or heard from friends who have kids about their kids playing this game.
Oh,
but there's something very magical about hearing those experiences recounted because of the way that it's really sort of like the mark of like a really sort of, intelligent puzzle designer, that you can make a puzzle that is one satisfying for both children and adults.
Yeah.
But that also, like, cognitively, children and adults are approaching in very different ways.
Yes.
And I find the one experience that seems to that seems to unite kind of all of my friends who have had kids who play this game and have seen kids play this game, is that adults are sort of constantly overcorrecting, or not overcorrecting, are over designing solutions, or over engineering solutions.
Yes,
is the word I'm looking for.
And in fact, in some ways, this I feel like is both not just an effect of like age or even other. It's not like your classic race, class, gender, nor is it classic generation stuff only. It is also that if you were used to that style of game, especially from like Ocarina through Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, there was only one solution. Unless you like fucking glitched the game entirely, there was really only one solution. And in fact, by someone like Skyward Sword, it's actually pretty stale, I have to say. I like that game, don't get me wrong. It's fun, it's cool. But like there is literally only one way of doing things. And sometimes it's pretty hard and pretty obscure. Whereas one of the things that really got introduced with Breath of the Wild and then explodes in Tears of the Kingdom is there's 100 ways of doing any given puzzle, even the ones that are like the designed little puzzle boxes.
Well, good. Very excited to get into it. We have a range of things to cover, but before we do, let's take a short break. And when we return, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Welcome back to Pop Cultural Marxism. So, many places we could begin. One thing that, as a first-time player, really stood out to me kind of came from the fact that kind of, as I was starting this game, I was also teaching a course on like capitalist architecture, in the course of which we had read a couple of pieces on Disneyland. Michael Sorkin's You and Disneyland is a classic essay, but also kind of going even further back, Louis Morin's Disneyland is Degenerate Utopia, which is wonderful. Baudrillard's writing on Disneyland. But kind of across those texts, right, what's interesting is that like as a theme park, right, Disneyland is sort of part World's Fair and part Garden City, right? It's sort of the spectacle, and it's sort of the center castle and kind of radiating outward from it. All of these little thematic, like fiefdoms, I think Sorkin calls it. But the map of kind of the first Disneyland map actually looks remarkably similar to the map of Hyrule. And I was thinking about why it was that this sort of kept coming to mind as I was playing beyond that fact. And I think it was because part of the pleasure of this game is that it really is the way that it encourages you it doesn't kind of plot out its narrative on the map, but really encourages you to kind of traverse space in counterintuitive or unexpected or otherwise really creative ways, right? And there's very much a sense in which sort of but before we began recording, Ajay and I were comparing this kind of feature that what is it? A hero's?
It's called the hero's journey.
It's called the hero's.
No, it's not the hero's path.
The hero's path.
That would be too ridiculous.
Right.
They call it the hero's journey.
And which is sort of a little like line marking on your map of kind of the path that you've taken through the world of Hyrule, and ours are very different, despite kind of being at roughly similar stages in the game. And I was reminded immediately of these. So this is the cover of Guy Debord's Psychogeographic Guide of Paris.
Oh yeah,
right. These sort of these projects by groups like the Situationist International in the 60s and 70s to sort of encourage people to develop strategies that kind of counteract the logic that dictates or partially dictates kind of how we move through space, right? In a kind of world that's ordered according to a certain economic logic, right? And this game has so much of that for me in it because of the ways that, not just kind of in its open worldness, but also in the ways that this game intensifies, that by sort of allowing you to kind of fuck with physics,
Yes.
like really encourages you to move through space in ways that are that feel so liberating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Tears of the Kingdom carries over from Breath of the Wild is a really unique sort of design. I'm going to be very heavy on designing and engineering today, whatever. A sort of design and engineering problem that is very common in open world games, right? Which is that like, oh, look, I've got all this space. And we talked about this in the Elden Ring episode, right? I've got all this space. I can go a place. And in fact, this can have a creepy dimension, especially if depending on like the context and the story being told and things like this, where it can feel very like colonial, like I can go all these places. Everywhere is for me.
Right. The coming out on the plateau and seeing kind of the world literally.
Yeah, the world
feet.
at your feet. Right. I think Zelda does some things to push back on that. But in terms of like pure design, they actually tried to break this. Right. And I often think in my mind of the if you listen to, I forget if I used this as a reference in a previous episode, but if you listen to like directors' commentaries from Valve, who create things like Half-Life and Portal, and mostly actually the platform Steam, they'll talk about all the ways in which a game designer can sort of like nudge you without telling you to go in a certain direction. And if you look at the way in which people play most open world games, which the team that was designing Breath of the Wild did intently. So they studied things like Skyrim and something from Rockstar, either Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption. They were like, how do you break that? Right? Right? Because you'll be there and you'll like have a landmark or you'll have a quest objective. And a couple of things they did to break this. One, simply is the map, right? The map, even when you like unlock bits of map, if you're familiar with like Ubisoft, like Assassin's Creed games, or with like the big Sony games like Horizon Zero Dawn, right? You unlock them and it unlocks all the like waypoints, all these like, little like challenges and things that you can do, little like, points of interest. Whereas Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do not, right? It'll get basically a topography, but it's up to you to see stuff. And they actually did a couple of really interesting things to achieve this. One, they literally recreated real space and had Linker run around it. So you were mentioning it's like Kyoto.
Yeah, I think when they were thinking about how to sort of scale the game in terms of, like the amount of time or Link takes to run across the space, or like the amount of stamina required to.
Yeah. So like one, they sort of played with real spaces in the world to see like how they fit in. And Tears of the Kingdom, this is even more incredible because like something I discovered literally last night while preparing for this is that like, right, like you often encounter game spaces where it's like, oh, this has like 16 floors below the surface. But in Tears of the Kingdom, it is literally three-dimensional enough that if you go from the outside in the underworld, you can see and encounter those 16 floors down. So it's all very physical and very interrelated. And they also sort of set up...
The fact that they've used the mirror image.
Yeah, that thing is so beautiful. Yeah. For people,
the topography.
Yeah. The thing is he's mentioning, right, is that the topography of the underworld sort of mirrors in many ways features of the overworld. And there's also this sky world. So it's like this like incredible three-dimensional depth. But the thing that carries over from Breath of the Wild as well is this staggering of triangles and sight lines such that you're constantly sort of tugged depending on what you're interested in. And again, just like in my past like couple of days preparing for this, I would be like, oh, I've got to do this thing before I record with Izzy, and then end up doing something else because the way the game is designed, I'm gonna be drawn to something else along that path. I'll be like, oh, I'm just gonna go over there for a second, and then I'm on like a 30-hour new mission, like doing like newspaper deliveries or finding a fucking sword, and you're like, what the hell?
So wait, for listeners who don't know, say a little bit more about this triangle sightline.
Yeah. So like imagine you have it's hard to me to do this without like using lots of other game references, but like, right, if I'm sitting at like a tower, this is like like almost all open world games have some version of this tower, right? That like is the hub. In Elden Ring, it was the sites with the maps, those little plinths with the maps, right? In Assassin's Creed, it is just fucking towers. So one thing that they did was, the towers aren't on your map, right? So you got to find them. They're not that hard to find, right? They have these big shiny lights, but you can't see them because they have made a geography, right? I'm doing this thing with my hands that no one listening can see, but right, built of triangles. So like if the tower is behind a mountain here, right, and I decide to climb it, I can see the tower. But if I'm right, I can't see it from here. And if I come around the right side, over here, there's a shrine. Over here, there's a settlement. There's a house. If I'm very excited about meeting new characters, maybe I go to the house. If I am like, I really will need to get, something from that shrine, I go to the shrine, and all of a sudden I am drawn away. And it's really funny you raised the Situationist, who I don't know that well. But I was thinking that unlike most open world games, which kind of promise a dream of a flâneur, Tears of the Kingdom delivers both the sort of critical real and the sort of dream wish, if you will, of the flâneur, right? Which is this kind of like joy of wandering, of getting drawn off course, and of not just drawn off course, but not kind of following prescribed paths or roads or like lines between kind of a point A and a point B, right? Yes,
like I can get to the city by walking up the path that spirals the mountain, or I can jump from the sky.
Exactly. And in fact, right, it totally works. Like, so the way in which they decided this work is when they got enough heat, they used a kind of like heat map, essentially, very similar to what is in the game now. And they only when the heat map started showing significant divergence, that people were really doing things in their own way, where they okay, now we're on to something. And that was pretty revolutionary. Like, that did basically redefine what an open world game could be.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's made, it's sort of generated its own kind of sort of commentary and social afterlife, because everyone is kind of doing something different. That's right. In a different order.
Yeah. That's absolutely right.
The fact that there's kind of a series of main kind of components for the main quest line, which involve kind of these four regional temples, and the dialogue for all of them is basically identical.
Yes.
So you can really complete them in any order. All of the sort of your collaborators at each of these.
And we can use their name. They're called, in the game, they're called sages.
Oh,
right?
sages.
Yeah.
Sages.
And it doesn't really fucking matter, right? Yeah. You're sort of building your team.
Yes. Yeah. And they all kind of have the same realization articulated in the same way, kind of when you do their dungeon quest. And so it really sort of takes the stress of having to sort of get the narrative off of you as a gamer, because it's so carefree. Yeah,
and one of the things that is, to me, a real, again, we're still in the realm of engineering and design before we even get to maybe some of the more literary or purely aesthetic questions. Not that these things aren't related. One of the other real sort of design achievements is that all the story beats essentially can be played in any order. And it's not, in fact, Tears of the Kingdom in particular is not a story poor game. There's a lot of story in it. But you sort of stumble upon story and it becomes additive. And it's actually quite a feat of design. I pulled off the shelf some of my game studies books, and Jesper Jewell, for example, is a very well-known game theory guy, not game theory, the math sense, game, video games. is like always, there's always this tug between, you know, narrative and rules and stuff like that. And really like you have like a half literary style or a half narrative style. And one of the things that's really fascinating and sort of, it's not just a pleasure, it's like an achievement or something of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, is that they're really in sync, the storytelling, in addition to the classic sort of sandbox storytelling, which is like, oh, the way I did this was X. And it's not just the way I did this, right? That's could be for like the puzzles, but it could also just be like, oh, I decided to build I mean, this is very much Tears of the Kingdom because they added this whole immersive sim building system. Like, I built the 3-stage rocket because I felt like it. Like,
yeah. And there's a lightness to these and a sort of like a kind of aphoristic quality to all of these kind of mini quests that you do, such that on the one hand, they kind of like together amount to the sum of their parts when thinking about more than the sum of their parts when you're thinking about kind of the overall story, but also function as like these like beautiful little kind of moments in themselves. That when you were speaking, what came to mind was there's a book by Nanni Balestrini called Tristano, which is a sort of inspired by the legend of Tristan and Isolde, and it was published in the 60s in Italy, but every published copy of the book shuffles all of the paragraphs.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like, you know, Umberto Eco was I think he wrote the introduction, was big on this, but this sort of quality of like being able to ascertain a story from all of these smaller poetic moments that kind of work together, but can be thought through and pursued independently.
It's like it's the challenge, right, is the sort of nonlinearity, right? Especially if you're not going down the path of like even most I'm thinking here mostly of cinema, like, or visual art, like, but right, even nonlinear cinema usually has a certain kind of logic to it.
Right, exactly.
Whereas here it really is like clip 14 and clip 1, or like story 7, and like these billion side stories like fit into fleshing out the world and fleshing out what has happened and fleshing out what you are doing. And that's a really sort of different way of telling a story. The other thing that I was thinking of when you were describing sort of the wandering, the situationist version of this, is that one thing that makes Tears of the King very different from Breath of the Wild, right? So if this like sort of very broad design stuff is very similar, one thing that's very different is Breath of the Wild is very desolate. It's very empty. It's very lonely. And another thing that I forgot to mention up front is that is different about, especially these last two. I mean, it's in some of the earlier ones as well, is it's not like it still has this formulaic save the princess bullshit. But in these later ones, you failed. Or like the team, it's actually usually Zelda, not Link, somehow failed in the past, or the team of people, the kings or whatever. And actually Ganon, the sort of bad guy who always reincarnates. Reincarnation is something I want to come back to. But like, you always know in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that you fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, it begins with this cutscene where you see Zelda and Link fucking up because they touched something. And it is one of the only in the series that actually begins with a cutscene. We were talking about this earlier. There might be a few others in the earlier, but it's generally not done like that. Voicing was only added to the series very late. I believe Breath of the Wild was the first. And Link has always been, well, we'll maybe get to his muteness and his weirdness, but it went from being everyone is kind of mute. Well, everyone is certainly not voiced. Right. And to Link in particular, not now sort of being canonically mute. So his silence has become kind of more sort of philosophically interesting. Right. But even so, like forgetting like that for a moment, like
in Tears of the Kingdom, you often run into other people and other sort of story. Again, there's much more of this sort of story interaction stuff. Whereas in Breath of the Wild, there was a much more overwhelming, they were really hitting you with how much you had fucked up. And this was a fallen kingdom and it was in a sorry state of affairs.
Yeah, no, and this is all of this kind of backstory is kind of really interesting for me to learn because, of course, this being my first game, when I came to the game, I kind of the fact that Link was silent was so fascinating and funny and at times kind of
confusing
and oddly aggravating to me. Sort of like, you know, there was an almost Jason Bourne quality where it's like you wake up, everyone knows you, everything expects something of you. You don't really know who you are.
Yeah, I mean, that's very unique to Tears of the Kingdom as well, because normally, like in Zelda games, like there is some weird mythos in the background that like, maybe Link always gets some piece of the Triforce that I forget. But honestly, like most of the other games, Link's just some dude. Like usually a kid, sometimes an adult, but just some guy. Not particularly special. And not particularly seemingly smart either. And like possessing no special magic or whatever. And one thing that's very funny in Tears of the Kingdom, it being a direct sequel, is there is sort of a mild Legend of Link going around now, but like no one gets it right. Like, so you encounter people along the road being like, the one I was thinking of earlier was there's all the regions have different peoples. It's interesting, right? One of them's the Gerudo, and that's sort of a matriarchal, sort of semi-caricature, like Middle East kind of society, I suppose, but like with the gender relations slightly switched. And they're talking about Link, and they're like, oh, he must be like 6.5 feet tall and like shoot lasers out of his eyes.
Right.
And Link's right there. And they're like, yeah, the opposite of that guy.
Right. And so like, the game is sort of, it has such a kind of light touch with this, but I'm like, oh no, like dramatically as a conceit, that's very interesting to me about like a person who lives in a world where there is a legend of him. Yeah. And he has nothing to say on the matter. He's not stressed by it. Yeah,
it's weird. It is weird like that. It maybe made more sense in the earlier games when he was depicted as a child. Because he is very childlike. He's very simple. He's embarrassed.
He's a holy fool.
Oh wow! Say more.
No, just this. Like he's not, as you know, as you say earlier, he's kind of the bearer of some quest, but he doesn't quite understand or.
Yeah, like he knows he's got to do it. But almost like. What was the literary? This didn't come up in our earlier things. I was thinking about the comparison I would make would be to Oblomov. Do you know this? Goncharov, the Russian novelist. Oblomov is like the weirdest book on earth because the main character, Oblomov, is this nobleman who like doesn't get out of bed for the first 100 pages because he has like no will. So he like eventually gets out of bed like when his butler tells him to. And like Link is almost like that. Like it's like he doesn't know what to do until someone gives him the lightest touch. And then he's like, all right. But then it also fits so well with that sort of flânerie and wandering thing. Because then he's like, oh, I need to find a drummer for this band. This is an actual quest in the game, right? And you do it. You're like, oh, sure. Now I'm doing that. I'm not like trying to prevent Apocalypse 2.
Right. That's so funny. That's so funny because I mean there was one point I was joking about it. I'm like there's in the universe of Hyrule there's like a version of it's Werner Herzog and it's like only the monsters can grant him the anonymity that he so clearly desires.
I mean, yes, it's I don't know how to respond.
He's such a funny character.
I mean, one of the classic sort of. I mean, there is like almost like a debate about this. Okay. Like I think this is outside of Zelda, which is the like, is it somehow better to inhabit a fully characterized person? So like, I listed off a whole list of games before, like, right? Like something like Horizon or God of War, right? Where there's a very specific character that you are inhabiting. And in fact, for me, for God of War, that's very like iffy, because like Kratos is kind of a horrible human being. But right, like that's very different than.
But even in some open worlds, right, there are still like irrevocable decisions you make. So I'm thinking of like in Elden Ring, you don't necessarily have a sort of rich internal life, but like if you kill the turtle pope, he's dead.
Yes, good, exactly. Right, so the Elden Ring model is very. In fact, I mean, they studied Breath of the Wild as part of their template. They even for their earlier games, they have cited influence from Zelda. FromSoft did. But right, yeah, the other model versus the character model is the what's it called, the silent protagonist. And this gets into these sort of weird questions of like realism and agency, and like things that I don't always think matter as much. Like even in a game like this, where it sounds like this wandering, or like the unique puzzle solving, or like that your path and my path look nothing like each other's, like doesn't necessarily speak to the art being agential, as much, to me at least, as it speaks to the art being combinatorial.
Yeah, absolutely.
One can think about this in a number of ways. If you're thinking about this purely through games, think about something like Tetris, right? Like, right, you're like, in many ways, this is almost like a platonic ideal game. But there is like a right move. At any given time, there's like a billion things you could do, but there's really is a right move. And even things like chess or Go, right, very complex board games, often have a kind of mathematical sublime, but still within like there is a correct, right? This is why those like debates about AI playing are in some ways not that interesting, right? Because often like beyond maybe a few initial things, there is a like correct choice and an incorrect choice. Something that happens in something like Tears of the Kingdom, right? So if I think about it not only as a three-dimensional world, but as layers of systems on top of systems, right? So there's maybe this like action RPG survival thing happening here, and then above it is this physics system, and above that is this building system. All of a sudden, I did not intend, I was thinking more with like the game design people in my head and less with like, my go-tos like Adorno. But I did in fact find, while I was like really trying to like anchor the theory of this episode, I found both in Adorno and Benjamin this reference to this sort of combinatorial ideals, and particularly being realized in the Baroque. So if you think about things like Bach, like a Bach cantata, or actually Rebecca is so good at this stuff. If you go back and listen to some of our practical criticism, where Rebecca talks about like the sort of wildly almost modernist, like avant-garde sounds that the late Baroque produces, it's often the argument that like Adorno puts forward, and I also found in Benjamin's early work in The Origin of German Tragic Drama, which I want to come back to that as well, is this idea that like the basic systems in something like Baroque composition, right? So counterpoint, harmony, et cetera, theme and variation, end up producing more than the composer can expect, or that the musician intends, even with their like interpretive performance. And this is not just in terms of like how in the Baroque you had improvisation. It's also like the sonic effect exceeds what the composer can imagine. And this is like an early, for these aesthetic thinkers, this is like an early form of the sort of the experimental avant-garde.
I mean, it's so interesting that you're saying this, because right now, my partner who plays the harpsichord has been focusing specifically on figured bass notation and improvisational work.
I had to learn figured bass back in the day.
And I mean, it's interesting that sort of so much of the language is kind of continuous across this sort of puzzle, this kind of beauty of puzzles. And yeah, because a lot of time, if you like
God, I did not expect to talk a lot about Baroque music today. I did prep on Baroque drama. But in Baroque music, yes, in fact, a lot of times you almost feel like if you go through the well-tempered clavier, it's like you're solving the puzzle of the piano. You're solving the puzzle of tuning. And in something like, people are going to think I'm a fucking lunatic from jumping from Bach to Zelda. But right, in Tears of the Kingdom, like especially when you're in one of those shrines, let alone in like the actual like total like free play sandbox world.
And the shrines really are special, just like as...
I have another heretical opinion, which is I like shrines better than dungeons.
Of course, if they release...
Oh, but like most Zelda fans hate that.
No, I love the shrines. If they released the DLC that was just 200 more shrines,
I would eat it up in a second. Yeah. No, but it was like the number one fan request was bring back dungeons from Breath of the Wild, because that had been the sort of main feature of the game for so long. And I have to say, don't attack me, internet, I swear. But there is this like streak of conservatism in gamers that, and I don't mean this as like conservative republic, like political movement, but this kind of like aversion to change.
Of course.
And I actually found that the shrine design, even in Breath of the Wild, where it was not as open-ended as it is in Tears of the Kingdom, it'd be so refreshing. And it really fit I think we talked about this again with Elden Ring, but it was the other way around, where like the big tight dungeons spots in Elden Ring, like to me at least, felt like being drawn out of the world into this special little place. Whereas the like smaller things and the shrines are perfect, just feel like a part of that world. They did a good job managing to bring the dungeons back in, but this kind of bring it back to the aesthetic question. Yes, the little shrines are like the perfect example of this combinatorialism. Or when you build the like or try to build like these devices and play with physics and then either succeed or fail, it always exceeds both what you, probably the player, thought was going to happen, but also what one of the things that the designers went into doing with this game was they saw the way in which people would break these systems in Breath of the Wild, and they were like, well, actually, that seems to be the fun thing.
Yeah.
So what if we give them even more game-breaking tools?
Right. So I remember when we were talking about Elden Ring, we had this discussion about how you can make some basically one of the ring wraith equivalents, like jump off a bridge if you kind of sit in a particular place, and how we were both also like bow and arrow fans and of kind of trying to snipe things from as far away as possible, and wanting more of the pleasure of that. And I think this game does that so beautifully.
Oh yeah, and like you can even see it in the way that if you ever get a chance, like watch reactions of the designs, be like, oh my God, like I never thought someone would do that.
Yeah.
And it's not like this sort of like secret sauce of like pure will or agency or something like that. You're still playing within a set of rules and all this stuff. But again, the beauty of this sort of combinatorial aesthetic, if you will, is that it produces these effects that are like unpredictable and greater than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of actually like being able to kind of go back into the shrines and solve them
have
again.
you done them more than once?
Yeah, I've done a few of them more than once.
Oh, wow. I have not. I just like encountered one the other night that I just know, because it often will prompt you with like a suggestion, almost of like how
the
it
name
can
of
be done.
the shrine.
Yeah, it'll be like play with gravity or something. And I did one with the most dumb logic where it was supposed to be like swinging balls and weights and things like this. And I just like stuck logs onto it until it hit a target. Yeah. And that it worked was just so, also very funny. There's a lot of humor in this game. That's another thing to talk about.
Yeah.
For a game that is actually so quite sad, it is full of humor, but also that kind of humor is just hilarious.
Right.
We're like, I'm actually going to do the dumbest solution to this. I'm just going to stick as many logs onto it until it works.
Right. Or like the ones where there's like a giant weighted ball that you can dispense.
Yep.
I'm like, I'm going to have it dispense as many as possible and stick them all together to make a bridge.
Yeah. I mean, so I've done things like that. There's one of the things that both these games have are these sets of sort of abilities that Link has. So in Breath of the Wild, these were mostly elemental. Like he can make an ice block appear. He could stop something in time. That's pretty similar to one of his things. Things like that. What was the other one? Like a fire or a bomb thing? A bomb. He could make bombs. In this one, it's been replaced by a bunch of manipulation powers. So one's called, oh God.
Ultra Hand.
Ultra Hand is the main one, which allows you to basically stick any two things together ad infinitum. And it really is almost anything.
Anything at any point. There's no sort of
did think there was a grid.
There is a grid, but it's very, very, it's not, it's very, very.
The grid is implicit.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's and the angles
right. Yes.
are like,
things don't snap into place at right angles.
The angles have there's not right angles, but there is like a 45. I think it's hard to get something greater than that. And in fact, a lot of the little that's one of the powers. Another one that's super funny is called Ascend, which was left over as part of the debug kit.
Yes. Yeah. They were using it as a shortcut for when they were exploring tunnels and things.
Yeah, and then realized that in fact it was boring to get out of to backtrack out of tunnels. So instead of making exits, they left you with this tool. And I won't go through all of them, but all these abilities play into these combinatorial systems, right? So another one is fusing weapons together, which often can lead to very unexpected comedic or interesting physics problems.
Yeah.
So a really easy example of this is if you are wearing metal and it is a thunderstorm, you can be struck by lightning. And if you switch out that stuff for wood and cloth, you will not.
Whereas you can't navigate, lava world.
Right.
With wooden weapons because they'll catch fire.
They'll catch fire. And in fact, there are parts of the super hot area that the air is essentially on fire, which is actually very frightening.
Or things like, in addition to elemental things, if you attach sort of a frond leaf to a weapon, it'll have an air vacuum effect that pushes someone. Yeah,
and you can use it to. I mean, this is the thing. This is the fun, right? Or you can use it to push a raft.
Right.
You can do these sort of very high tech things, which is now all over the internet, people making fucking Star Wars AT-ATs and you were showing this before and aerial drones and shit.
Someone basically made a torturous headpiece for the dragons so that they could basically farm dragon teeth or something.
Wait, what? Nice dragons?
So one thing we've learned about one of these features, auto build, is that people love weapons of war and machines of war, and an entire extremely funny web culture has kind of sprung up around making the most monstrous auto build weapons that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, it's funny to me that that's where most people take it. I did build a bunch of sort of auto drone type things, but mostly to avoid combat. One of my favorites is there's a device that produces electricity. You stick it on top of a little weird head thing that heads towards enemies, and put that on a little car device, and it will just keep shocking the guys as they run around, and then you just don't have to worry about the enemies. You just keep going about your day.
Right. And you can attach, these giant metal spiky shields to them on all sides, so that people get hurt when they try to strike them.
I mean, some of the things that people have done, again,
truly amazing.
Yeah, I've only ended up. I was saying this earlier before as we were prepping. One of the things that is really shocking to me about this game is I've played 100+ hours. And not looked up a solution basically ever. I've looked up things to how can I get X number of things very quickly? That kind of farming strategies and stuff. And what I end up encountering is these game guide stuff and it'll be listing things I have already done, but in ways that are like, this is how you do it. And I'm like, that's not how I did it at all.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. No, that's right. In contrast to, sorry, again, to make the comparison with our Elden Ring discussion, you recalled sitting there with all of your spreadsheets and your notes and being like, this is homework. I need to study a whole... Yeah,
no, absolutely. I was going to say, in Elden Ring's defense, there because I was listening to our episode about that to prep for this, and Joseph had raised one of the boss battles that he had like really struggled with it being very hard, and that I had solved by just running around the arena for like 45 minutes and letting other characters do it.
But those were the best moments in Elden Ring,
right? And in some ways, what's the name of the division? It's really something very boring. Entertainment analysis and development. The names of the internal divisions at Nintendo are not the most compelling. But like one of the things that this design studio has essentially achieved in these two games, and in particular in Tears of the Kingdom, is to make the whole game that. There's almost no part of the game that can't turn into one of those kinds of situations.
Right.
And that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And like, when this first came out, I remember I follow a lot because I'm so interested in games. I follow a lot of game designers and coders and engineers. And a lot of them were like, there's almost like a meme, like amongst game designers being like, if a producer or a game creator came to me and was like, okay, triple the size of the map. Okay, make everything have like actual logical depth and interaction with a fully functional, realistic physics system.
Right. Total interchangeability and also realistic physics.
And now give the player the ability to use this series of 27, 30 something like mechanical devices, which A, can be infinitely produced, and B, can be attached to any number of materials in the world, like rocks, stones, etc. Rocks and stones are the same thing. Stones, trees.
Oh no, we have rocks of different sizes.
Yeah, rocks of different sizes. And like the joke was like most of the people were like, even if I was working on like a fucking supercomputer, let alone like the Nintendo Switch, was just essentially like the computing power of a modern toaster.
Yeah.
Right? Like
it's wild.
Like they were like, I would be like, no fucking way. And like this to me like does like tie it back to the earlier conversation of like some of the unique qualities of development where like they are like apparently as far as like interviews and stories go, Tears of the Kingdom was finished a year and a half ago, and they just spent, and Nintendo was like, you know what, spend a year and take another year and just do polish, just make sure everything works. And like that kind of decision is enabled, of course, by market conditions and certain kind of business strategies. But it also then shows in the final work, if you will. Games are, it's always weird, difficult to talk about the sort of like game art is like, what is it, blah, blah, blah. I feel like that debate ended a long time ago and just no one noticed. But right, like part of what we're talking about here is produced in that sort of that polish of those systems.
And I think this idea of kind of sort of so many people taking pleasure in this particularly sort of polished quality of it is also says something about sort of cultural consumption in the moment, right? Because what is the one thing we hear? Well, what is the one thing we think when we watch all of these Marvel movies, which is it looks rushed, it looks unfinished.
Yes.
It looks like they were down to the wire and had to make so many like shortcuts, and it looks terrible, right? And with this, even though sort of it's not as even though it's sort of on much older technology, it has this quality of feeling finished and polished and fully thought through in a way that like makes it not just among games, but among sort of cultural objects that are produced now generally, like especially lovely. Yeah, no. So like there is like a beautiful parsimony. Is that the word I want? Right? Like to what they've now we're actually, I did not expect to talk about this, but I do think it's actually really amazing. Right? That like part of the beauty of
Tears of the Kingdom is that you can get this kind of like, combinatorial beauty, combinatorial sublime, whatever the phrases you want to use for that, using so little, right? Like, I'm sure they spent $1 bajillion. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like an idiot. But it's also not, I mean, we started this series talking about Rings of Power, right? It's also not a fucking $1 billion TV show.
Exactly.
And it, in some ways, excels because of that, right? A lot of the decisions go into, for example, visually. We were talking about, it kind of has this like, watercolory, impressionistic sort of figuration, but impressionistic design that works really well, but is mostly dictated by an aesthetic that will look good without having to push too many polygons at you, right? It has this beautiful. I was talking about this with Elliot, our producer, earlier. Nintendo. When everyone else was going down the HD route, they emphasized like recording scores.
Yes.
Right? Like, so like in the PS3, Xbox 360, Wii era, like, right, Nintendo was not making HD games, but when they made the Mario Galaxy 1, they scored it with a lot, like, I think it might even be the Tokyo Philharmonic or something. I have to look it up, but like, and it just like is mind blowing.
Right.
That was made a greater impression on me than the more photorealistic graphics. And similarly here, you have these audio design features that are, it features like very clean and usually quite minimal piano, and then it switches into sort of neoclassical and romantic sort of grandeur, but that is very expressive. But does so with extremely little tech need. Yes.
I mean, as like the sort of sensory experience of this game is sort of it's such a distinction from this kind of like HD.
Yeah, like it's
not doing the most.
Yeah, it's not the most game possible.
Exactly.
I mean, in some ways it is, right? Because it lasts so long and there's so much to find. There's so many little cute side stories and like all that. But in some ways it also like trusts you.
Yes. It trusts the intelligence of its players.
Yeah.
And doesn't try to overload them either visually or narratively or...
I was actually thinking of because I was thinking so much about this math question. That scene in Children of Men where the guy, they're in Battersea Station and the child of the minister of culture or whatever is playing a video game on his. Do you remember this at all?
I don't remember this scene.
Oh, it's they're like having dinner. I forget all their names now. This is embarrassing because I just taught this movie, and one of the characters is like basically this like affectless like teenager. He doesn't have a single line in the movie. He's just this guy's kid. And the father is like, take your meds. And eventually he does. But the whole time he's just playing this kind of like proto like cube puzzle phone game. And there's a way in which that, I think, is what people have in mind when they think about games and math. And it's kind of like this sort of anhedonia of like the endless scroll and things like that. And the thing about Tears of the Kingdom that's so fascinating is like has those qualities, but it pushes so hard against the like chronicity, is that a word? The time sense of that kind of like, I'm going to keep going. I have to scroll. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think in part because
I'm going to keep going at this pace, or I'm not going to get sidetracked.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's in part because it has this, even in sort of its sort of puzzle-like mathematical quality, it has a wit and a creativity.
Yes.
And and a sort of, the music is fantastic. We could talk about the music forever. I think every single number on the soundtrack is an absolute banger. I love the Molduga music.
I mean, I didn't actually look up if Koji Kondo did all the music for the most recent one. I doubt it. But it is, he didn't do any of it. But the original Zelda theme was by Koji Kondo, who did also the Mario theme, who is like a just giant of soundtrack music. And a fun fact that we talked about earlier is that originally they used the theme, the Bolero theme from, it's Bizet, right?
Ravel.
Oh, Ravel, my bad. Thank you. They found out they couldn't get the rights, and he wrote the original Zelda theme in one day. And the original Zelda themes, this is that kind of Rush thing, but it's a different kind of Rush thing. That is like so moving and iconic. In fact, is one of the things that first drew me to the game. And their use of music is so strategic and interesting, and also jives with another set of aesthetic qualities that like this game sort of like, there's often this tension between games and cinema, like games trying to be cinema and cinema actually aping games, right? But the relationship between something like these late Zelda games and cinema, to me at least, reaches back to the language of old cinema, of like silent film era cinema. So there's this constant interplay. For example, there's this running gag throughout the game, right, that plays with these systems where you keep meeting this guy who's working for a construction company, that it's like a public-private partnership, by the way.
And we can talk about that and about the company town. That is,
like, and then, there's the Yonorbo Co. and all that stuff. But anyway, whatever. So like, but there's this guy and he's like devoted to his CEO, and it's weird. And it's also just funny because it does fit. Now we're getting closer to the post-apocalypse stuff, but like, right, they are rebuilding, right? And everyone's sort of happily going about their day. The world is kind of in a fucked up state, and like, they're like, like creepy goo is like eating everyone alive, but we're just not going to worry about that. We're going to keep on our house building. Anyway, this one guy is throughout the world, and he's always trying to prop up a sign. You have to figure out how to use any number of materials to help him. And there's a billion ways of doing it. Once you come up with a solution, right? He's like, oh, the guy is standing. He doesn't actually say this. Right. It's just a caption.
A caption that says like, oh, like, let's get this secured.
Yeah. And then the screen goes blank, exactly like you would in an old silent film, especially late silent film era. And there's a series of non-verbal sounds, usually some combination of like percussion, like canned sounds of construction,
like grunting
and grunts.
Yeah.
Which also was a thing that would be used in that kind of thing, or even in some theatrical productions like pre-cinema. And this game tends to borrow on that kind of aesthetic logic to a great comedic effect. And it also does it in the sort of more serious and much more somber and much more sad story sequences, which are often introduced with like classic sort of fades and wipes, and introduced and ended with this, again, the language of cinema that I associate with like not even avant-garde or whatever, but just early, just like the earliest film techniques.
I'm thinking also of the when you're in the Korok forest and you kind of go off course and you're lost, right? The screen fades to white and you hear a yaha before you're kind of reset.
And a lot of that stuff, like the Lost Woods, the Deku Tree, all that kind of stuff, that has always been there in the previous Zelda games. And it is fast. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, like the Koroks. Like, what the fuck? They're like so strange.
Right. Their interests are pranks and being ill-prepared for camping.
Yeah, they're like, they would be pucks if they weren't so incompetent.
Right. They're sort of, I've compared them to the sort of, the like C-list backpacker YouTubers of the world of Hyrule. They're just like, they're there. They're not really ready for what they're doing.
Well, this is especially, there's many kinds of Koroks one will encounter. So yeah, for listeners who don't know this and not seen this game or ever played the Zelda game, right? There's sort of these weird leaf people.
Yes.
And in Tears of the Kingdom, this backpacking version that Izzy is talking about is introduced, and their backpack is always so oversized and they've always gotten separated. So one of the things that constantly...
Oh, it's from Japanese folklore.
Oh, say more.
I'm just on the... please correct me if I'm incorrect, because I'm just on the Zelda wiki. But apparently the name korok is derived from koropokuru, the little creatures that hide in like a certain kind of plant in Japanese folklore.
Oh, it actually sounds like the way, like, now that I think about it in those terms, that is the way like Icelandic people talk about elves, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
More as like mischievous sprites.
Sprites, yes.
Yeah. But here again, the incompetency comes up.
Right. So here, like one form they take is like they carry backpacks that are sort of 3 times larger than them.
Yeah.
And you'll always find one saying like, "I need to reach my friend who has the tent set up, but I'm stuck."
And then always the like tent, and it'll be marked with a little like green smoke signal, is like in a totally inconvenient direction.
Yes.
And often a very difficult like path to figure out.
Yeah. So you need to sort of find a way to sort of basically load this korok into a balloon or into some sort of device with which you can transport them to their friend.
And of course, and again, I've been like almost media blackout on this, but even that, I have seen some videos of the horrible things people do to koroks.
These are very aggravating little animals. And so when I spoke earlier about people constructing war machines, these machines are often used in the service of sort of mass executing koroks or sort of torturing them in various ways.
Since I've never tortured a korok nor accidentally dumped one into like the ocean or something, do they respawn?
They do.
They do? Yeah.
They do.
That's good.
They do. Yeah. I don't like them, but I would also be sad if they
you
died.
Don't like them?
I like the puzzle ones. I don't like the camping ones.
Oh, yeah. So the older, like the puzzle koroks, which are cleverer, that's like the mainstay of the series. Those have always been there. These new buffoon ones were added for Tears of the Kingdom. Although that I feel like is 99% of the fun of koroks in Tears of the Kingdom is the buffoon ones.
Yes. Although, yeah, I mean, maybe it's because I'd never kind of encountered the other ones before. I really like
it's not 99. That's not fair.
I really like this idea of kind of like finding in the visual grammar of the game these little indications that a korok might be
like those
somewhere.
little like arrows.
Yeah. Or a
like,
pinwheel.
It's the pinwheel. There's an arrow, often a tree stump. And you can like bet. And this is something else that is actually brings us back to like design and visual elements is like you can sort of bet that at the top of a hill, there'll be like a korok or there'll be something.
Right. Or if you find a rock in an odd location.
Yes, that's right. And pick it up. Yeah.
Why don't we turn to something else why don't we take our break?
Okay.
And then when we return, we'll talk a little bit about the kind of affect
and story.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.
Back. So one thing that really stood out to both of us about this game, right, is that the world of Hyrule, as it is kind of given to us here, is a world in which there is a kind of pervasive sadness, this sort of quality of mourning that kind of suffuses the game, and that's made, I think, all the more palpable by the inclusion of all of these side quests that are often quite comedic or poignant or warm or funny. Where do we want to begin? I mean, do we have favorite examples of this?
Do you have good examples of the light touch, the humor, the like joke? Like there so many of the little quest stories.
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
So one that really stood out to me was, I think the quest line is called Madison's Independence, which is about Hudson, the sort of president.
He's the CEO of, is he the president of the CEO?
The president of the construction company.
Of Hudson Construction.
Hudson Construction.
Which has been like sub-licensed by the Kingdom of Hyrule.
Yeah, we're gonna put a flag in that and return to it. But there's this really lovely story about Hudson and Ronson, his wife. What is his wife's name?
Oh God, I can't remember her name.
And his wife's daughter, Madison, who is, the wife is from Gerudo. And so this daughter, they live in Terrytown, and the daughter is going off to Gerudo to study, for her studies. And there's this lovely little story where you basically have to help Hudson through the heartbreak of like letting his daughter, like fly free for the first time and feeling very attached to her. And so you help her to kind of independently get to this little construction site where
I haven't even done this.
It's very sweet. It's really about kind of like letting go of your kids, wanting to hold on to your kids forever, and then like knowing that they're capable of being on their own.
That's very sweet, actually.
It's incredibly, and the quest line ends with you and the two of them like in a balloon, like going up in a balloon together and just watching the sunset or something.
Yeah.
It's very sweet.
I mean, it's funny, like when I was first thinking of this sort of part of the discussion, I was thinking of things that are more even just like pure comedy.
Oh, so of course.
For me, although they then like bleed into, this is why this game does storytelling, even though it doesn't do storytelling the way I think a lot of people who think about stories in games think about it, but it does it so well. I was thinking about very early on, like one of the things you can get sidetracked for like easily 20 to 30 hours on is this newspaper thing, which is like sometime between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the like bird people who are the Rito have decided to become the inventors and purveyors of Hyrule's first newspaper.
That's correct.
And you like encounter one of the bird reporters and you can like join the journalism team at like basically
you are their correspondent,
right?
In the
mostly
field.
Like discovering stories about the like where has Zelda gone, but also like side stories like, oh, there's a weird monster haunting this area. There's a ghost in the well, you know, all this kind of ridiculous shit. And it is just fucking hilarious. I mean, there's like the worst dad joke puns possible. So like the bird reporter will wave at you and say soar long. And I don't know why this is funny. That is not funny, but it fucking kills me every time.
Soar long. It's Australian.
And like, then like, but like you can literally go down a path and it's so fucking funny.
Yeah.
And you encounter then people reading the newspapers everywhere,
right? In stables, which kind of in a sort of literary storytelling mode, right? Like this stable as this point through which kind of people pass and where kind of stories are exchanged, and there's always someone there who's reading a newspaper. Yeah,
I mean, the joke Izzy and I had earlier before we started recording was like, it's almost like they're doing the early Habermas, like the structural transformation of the public sphere, because like we're both seeing the like germination of a kind of burgerlich bourgeois culture, like the very early sort of inklings of that. And we're seeing the technologies that facilitate that, whether they be like extractive industries, construction industries, or newspapers to spread the proper information for like price markets.
Right. Exactly. On top of which there's a very sort of like, there's this other layer of like very high tech sort of scientific development that is happening.
But that is that's where a more tragic thing, right? Because that is like derived from already in Breath of the Wild. One of the design things I actually like better in Breath of the Wild is that in the shrines are more beautiful in their outward appearance. And when you get to the end in Tears of the Kingdom of each shrine, you see a statue of Rauru and what's the woman's name? You see a statue of this like original ruling couple of Hyrule. It doesn't really matter. In the other ones, you would get this like desiccated, like last gasp of the Sheikah people. So it's some like wise Sheikah person who hands you the orb instead of them, and then sort of disintegrates. So it's almost like that, like this like stylite or monk has been waiting for you for like 2,000 years. But those things get us back into the tragic mode, right? Where it's like, oh, like.
I'm going to do one more funny example before we get to that, though. And this is the election that you end.
Oh, yeah. The election's great. It's another really good example because I stumbled into the election really early, I feel like.
Yes. So this is in, it's in Hidemaro, right?
Hateno. I suck with these names.
Which is this sort of, you kind of stumble into this like small town election between a farmer who's sort of a...
He's the farmer. The incumbent is the farmer mayor.
Yes, is the farmer mayor. And he's being challenged by an avant-garde fashion designer of mushroom-themed hats.
Yes.
Who's trying
dresses, but mostly hats.
Who's trying to convince the people of the village that she can kind of chart the way into a new future.
Yes.
And so you take part in this election. You kind of pick a side and you help the candidate. It doesn't matter which side you pick, but you help the candidate do a bunch of chores. In the case of, if you choose the avant-garde lady, you help her give mushrooms to people in the town. And then, this quest culminates with them being like, actually, we need both avant-garde fashion and agriculture.
I was making a joke to Izzy over text today where I was like, this is like the paradox of Asian developmentalism, the game. Because like literally the storyline is like, oh, our ancient like village traditions. Oh, our need for like attracting new business. How can we balance these things out?
Right. Exactly.
And it's like, it is like comedy. And like, of course, the like other joke in that is that secretly at night, the like avant-garde lady goes to like the simplest, to like some little like silo where she eats like the simplest vegetables.
Exactly.
And secretly the farmer is trying to develop a new kind of food, which I think is actually just like pizza or something. It's some kind of cheese-based substance.
Yes.
And like, so it's a nice, cute little story, but right, like this is a whole long like sub-story within this entire world. Although again, something that just blows my mind about this is that you encounter throughout the world people wearing those hats, and then they'll talk to you about it.
They'll be walking through they'll be walking through a volcanic region, just wearing a mushroom
wearing
hat.
These like ridiculous, and then did you get the hat? Her hat?
Yes, I did get the hat.
And it's like, what the fuck do you even do with it?
It's great. I love it. I wear it all the time.
Oh, really?
It's beautiful. It's a work of art. It's avant-garde. I love it.
No, that's a really, really good... I'm trying to think of some of the... some of the other ones that are just like that. Ones that we were talking about earlier. So the Gerudo people, right? Predominantly women, matriarchal, et cetera, but there's so few men that they have like, I have not actually played this one out, but I've only encountered that it exists. They have like a sex ed class, like that's like the birds and the bees. I haven't started that quest line, but it looks hilarious. And then another one that's similar with the sort of education, I know you want to talk about archaeology and stuff like this as well, is in that same village of Hateno.
You help the sort of schoolmaster there.
Yeah. And like
to teach these bratty kids who are like,
kids don't believe in history.
They don't believe in history. And so you have to go and take a picture of a historical document. And they're like, we have one historical source. Now we believe in history.
Yeah. But then the professor is like, oh, would you like to attend my lecture? Warning you, it's going to be quite long. And then if you give him this photograph of the document, he then proceeds to info dump the entire lore of the series over about 15 minutes.
Yes. Yeah. And then when you do his second quest line, you get the ability to plant your own produce.
Oh, I didn't know that. There's farming in this game? I knew there was like, there's like a Link's homestead, which you showed me yours. I didn't do that yet. You showed me the bizarre, the guys that collect the fucking bubble. Come on.
So the guy who collects the bubble gems, gremlin and his brother, who's also...
Yeah, what are they?
I just say gremlins.
Yeah.
They're gremlins. His brother is as it would happen, a sculptor who loves monsters. And you can, at some point in Terrytown, bring him the photos that you've taken for the Hyrule Compendium of various monsters. And he will make a 3D sculpture based on your photo.
It's just so fucking weird.
Which I love, because this is the one sort of like... I love this moment in the game because it's like, someone is sort of like doing something aesthetically for the future, like in perpetuity.
Yes.
Which is
and that is something that's happening. This is something I thought we'd get to towards the end, but it's really important. Like something that is to me sort of an interesting quality of this that calls back to many of our previous discussions is that we are in like the constructive phase of the post-apocalypse. So actually you encounter this guy building the statues. I didn't actually do that. I was blown away though. He's the first person I think in any Zelda, and frankly probably most games, who's like, I want people to know that monsters aren't all bad.
Right. I'm like, that's interesting. You're the most interesting character.
Yeah, there's like an inner life to monsters that people don't appreciate.
Yeah.
My life goal is that people will get them. Whereas the other guy's life, his brother's life goal is to become Satori.
I don't know what that is.
So Satori is a Japanese... Go ahead.
Is it the horse thing?
Oh, no, that's not I didn't do the horse god thing.
No, not the horse god. The thing that appears to you that has like bunny offspring. The blue guy.
Oh, God, I can't remember what those are called. You mean you shoot them and they drop gems? Or they drop rupees?
They're all the same color. There's one that's a horse.
There's one that's a horse. It's when you drop the... This is going to sound like we're like inhaling laughing gas or something, but this is real. When you drop the fruit in front of the cherry tree,
I haven't done this.
A blue horse shows up to you.
Oh,
to show you where all the caves are.
I mean, I don't know. Oh, I mean, there's like a bunny rabbit that shows you the caves, but it just sort of appears.
No, but there's like a granddad. Oh, here it is. It's a horse made of bunny rabbits.
Oh my God, I have never seen this.
But this is apparently Satori.
I mean,
right?
I was thinking Satori like in Zen Buddhism. Satori is like this concept of comprehension or like true understanding or true revelation.
Because that's also, I mean, I assumed that was where that was from. But Satori is also the name of
this horse. So that's what the other guy's brother wants to eat all these weird gems from these frogs that are in caves, and his goal is basically to become a bodhisattva. And you're just like, what? Like, how are these two guys like, what is the deal? And they are weird. They are gremlin-like. They only exist at night. In fact, it's very funny. If you try to interact with them in the day, they'll be like, oh, look at the time. And then they just like vanish in a puff of whatever. It's so strange. And the game is sort of like littered with this, right?
And I assume, and I don't know about these two in particular, I assume that a lot of these figures have counterparts in kind of Japanese lore.
I thought you were going to say in earlier games.
Yes,
I think in Japanese lore, I mean, this abuts on the conversation where they're like, I know they were looking at a lot of European stuff when they created it, but it seems to me to have a lot of South Asian stuff and East Asian stuff just in droves. Even the very setup, right? That is this constantly repeating story of the demon king who is from like this is like the Ramayana, right? Yeah. Except instead of Ram, right? The perfect king, you have Link, the absolute fucking nobody, right? But the sort of Zelda bit is sort of Sita. It just works so well. And like the general decline of things feels very much like early Sanskrit kind of stuff, like the Mahabharata, where you're stuff like, oh, we're just on a long downswing.
Yeah. And I mean, this gets us into this sort of peculiar quality of sadness or mourning in the game.
Yeah.
Which is that, like, you know, as we were talking about earlier, right? Zelda and Link, right, are these characters who know that things used to be better.
Like distinctly.
Yeah.
So like And there are other characters. So in this game, Pura is, in the previous one, she was there, but she had like artificially, I think, de-aged herself to childhood. And now she's grown up and has quite a haircut. Just put it that way. I'll get to Hot Ganon later. But
I'm looking at these two like...
While you were out, we talked about did you not encounter this, like, where the weird thing where people were really into Ganon?
No, but I mean that... No.
To be fair, they've always have been.
Oh, I feel like sexy Ganon's a new thing.
But I feel like sexy villain is also just a general, like...
Oh, I guess
trope
that's maybe that, yeah. I didn't even think about it. Because, like, in previous games, Ganon is sometimes not even incarnated as, like, a human being. Often he's a pig. But here he is, like 7 foot tall, shirtless dude, like, rippling long locks and, like, totally ripped muscles.
Oh, he's certainly large.
Yeah. I don't know if... in any case, how do we get here?
Mourning.
Yes, Mourning, right? So there are people like, and this guy, I think, talks to your interest about knowledge production in this world, right? Because there are these like archaeology people and science people. So
right. So there's also this other story, right, about a race called the Zonai,
right?
That are kind of responsible for the raw material that had in some previous age been mining this raw material that ends up getting used to kind of power scientific technology in this world, but they've kind of disappeared in the same way. It's sort of a like the sense I got kind of playing it is that they were like basically a people who got too greedy and like dug too deep.
Oh, really? Because I haven't gotten any explanation for the fall.
But I don't think you do in the game.
That's why I was saying it had that like Kali Yuga feel, this like these Sanskritic classics feel. Because this idea of the same story that unfolds with different incarnations is very much that like reincarnate. Like there's a very famous like Brahminical myth about it's not Shiva. Maybe it's Krishna. I'd have to go back and look. But it's Vishnu. And like Vishnu, I think, goes to Shiva and says something like, Shiva goes to Vishnu and is like, look at this parade. Oh no, I'm getting it wrong. Correct me if I get this wrong, people. But it's something like Vishnu comes along and is like, I'm the bee's knees, I'm the best. And Shiva's like, oh, really? Check out all these ants. And he's like, why am I looking at all these ants? He's like, that's all the Vishnus that came before you. Right? Like, you're just the Vishnu 45. Like,
except that there are all of these reminders and remainders in this world. Yeah,
I meant for the story overall, right? We keep getting this story. But yeah, we actually have two layers of this, right? Because in the first game, it's mostly the Sheikah, right? Who are the people that Pura and Robbie and all those cats are studying. And they are also like a sort of advanced tech civilization, although not to the same degree as the Zonai were before. And again, think about the chronology here. We're getting a ever decreasing degree of sophistication as we approach the present.
Yeah, and the one of the things that sort of really struck me, and this is kind of right at the beginning of the game too, is you're told that one of the things that the Zonai, or you see that one of the things that have been kind of left behind by the Zonai are these robot constructs.
Yes.
Who have, for me, the most pleasing sound effect in the game.
They have
really
this
like marbly stone sound.
Yeah.
But these constructs that have been kind of left behind and continue to
they're just running their program. They're robots.
They're robots. And the game kind of opens with, and I texted this to Ajay. Let me just pull it up. They're described as like their labor no longer serves a purpose, but they continue to perform it.
Yeah.
Which woof.
Yeah, it's not like, so like, right, all this other stuff, this like hilarious side stories, is sort of on the surface. And it is also very interesting. And I think this is going to bring us back to this question of genre, but from a more literary direction. That like most people outside of like, again, these couple of researchers and sort of like, frankly, the correct phrase to use is outside of the elite, right? Outside of the like royals and their immediate retainers seem to have very little. Right? Like people will be like, it's weird that these devices here, or like they seem to fall out of the sky here. And it's like, it's weird that now we see all these floating islands, right. But it doesn't really seem to affect their days.
Right. They kind of go about their business and they'll be like, my grandmother got sick because she touched some of the gloom that is sort of seeping out of the ground and out of everything. But anyway. Right.
So like, most people, and this is actually, I think, like both interesting and like, it's not a work of social realism. Let's put it that way. Most people seem highly unaware of the world. And yet like Zelda and Link, in their different capacities, are deeply aware. Right. This was sort of torturing my brain for almost like a week or more when we were putting this together. Like I was trying to go through all the different definitions of melancholy, and I was like, no, it's not that. It's not that. I was like, oh no, this is actual mourning, right? Because when you know the thing that you lost, like that's actual mourning. And that's the pervasive mood in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, even with this like the pratfall comedy, even with the comedy that emerges from gameplay, even with the comedy of these like sometimes like quite sweet stories, like the one Izzy just walked us through. The overall sense is, and you know, to use another sort of loaded term from the critical theory vocabulary, I realized, again, this was like 2 nights ago, maybe last night, I was like, oh, it's a fucking Trauerspiel. Yeah. It's a mourning play. It's literally playing mourning.
Right. I mean, or a Decameron. On the one hand, right, there's the reason this came to mind is because precisely of this kind of coexistence of a sort of larger context of world endingness. Also, like, these smaller stories, often quite funny, kind of told against this backdrop that serves as both sort of a contrast, but also an intensifier of the sort of overall sense of sort of tragedy. In
the other term, it's funny. I was asking another one of our colleagues earlier if there was a generic like sort of definition for Trauerspiel in German, and she said that in fact Walter Benjamin's is in fact the sort of foundational definition. So this is, I think, the Ursprung des deutschen Trauerspiel is like the hardest book, one of the hardest books to read. It was Benjamin's habilitation thesis that he had to withdraw because his committee, frankly, didn't get it, which included people like Max Horkheimer, by the way. Irony, I don't know if I've mentioned this on this podcast, actually, and this is right before our Frankfurt School events. This is a great irony to point out. Adorno's first teaching job was to teach the origin of German tragic drama at the university as an adjunct, basically, at the German a private docent, the German version of an adjunct. So Benjamin a little ahead of his time, but one of the things that so Trauerspiel was not exactly like the greatest genre. And in fact, like if you're looking for like great Baroque drama, you often think of people like Shakespeare. And Benjamin's Ursprung des deutschen Trauerspiel ends with a discussion of Shakespeare. But it's Shakespeare in contrast, so almost like Shakespeare as an early modern. Again, we're back in the Baroque. And in the Baroque, these German authors, people like Andreas Gryphius. I remember reading some of this fucking crap for my dissertation. It is actually quite bad. And in these mourning plays, you are the elites again, right? They mostly take place around court intrigue and one, again, this sounds very much like Zelda, right? Like some king is trying to overthrow some other king, yada, yada, yada. Everything is a symbol, right? It's like the classic symbolism kind of stuff. So crowns stand for this, swords stand for that. And again, that is just so much, that's not even just the game logic, that's true in so many games. But in Zelda, in the Legend of Zelda series in particular, everything has this kind of grander symbolic logic. And it's not just that like the Master Sword is the palace. It's also that the Master Sword represents a certain, literally, I hate to use this, but like a certain kind of divine violence that establishes the law. Yeah. It really is doing it to a letter. But the thing that's really fascinating about this version then of a mourning play, or this version of playing mourning, it might be more accurate, is they are historically aware. But the thing that Benjamin critiques in these is not that they're shittily written, although he does point that out too, but that they're sort of formal failures, because they end up never resolving their plots. At the end, everyone does this kind of like pat recitation of Christian eschatology, just being like, we'll never solve this historical problem. We'll all just be like saved and equals in the grace of Jesus in heaven or something like that, right? And that is absent here, right? So instead, right, we get those mythical elements. And part of the thing about Trauerspiel as well is that it recreates myth. So that's so perfect, again, here. But in place of the Christian eschatology is something more like a soteriology of reincarnation, or a soteriology of something. I don't know. Maybe this is a puzzle to solve. Yeah, the contrast is really interesting, right? Because these things sort of like freeze in their place. And for Benjamin, the like later plays, like modern plays that have a more modern conception of history, they like, I think actually there's a quote, they like lose eschatological certainty in place of of profane struggle, of politics, basically. We get real politics.
Right. Yes, exactly. The sort of, and the small town election is kind of like the perfect.
The small town election is one example. You encounter multiple political forms, including there's something so strange about the chronology or the way in which different sort of historical forms exist one on top of the other, right? Because Hyrule itself, it seems to be this like federated kingdom, right? Very traditional, right? Zelda's father, King Rome, who's dead at this point, right, is a classic monarch. Zelda is the daughter. She will be queen, I suppose, eventually. Actually, I never ascertained that until just this moment. Why is she not queen? Anyway, whatever. She's everywhere you go, everyone recognizes her as the kind of benevolent monarch, right? She is their ruler. But you also encounter, again, this sort of like weird matriarchal, again, it's semi-kingdom, but this matriarchal queendom, I guess, in the Gerudo. The bird people seem to have a kind of tribal democracy.
Right.
Right. I would call it like pre-modern communism.
Yeah.
And then
there's the rock people, which is a kind of
the Gorons.
Fraternal society of rock men.
And they are governed by a 19th century style company town.
Yeah.
That's their governance structure.
Yes.
So all these things exist at the same time.
It's actually, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, how often you often get sort of games with anachronism in it, but not necessarily games with multiple.
Formal anachronism.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny. I was going to mention that the other thing I have done, I did start the new Final Fantasy, but I'm not going to get far. But Final Fantasy is known for being like, yeah, let's just throw magic and cards together and see what happens. Boom, it's going to be cool. But this is different. This is
development of multiple historical forms.
And like I said, that little vignette with the election seems to really be about a kind of like phenomenology of developmentalism.
Yes.
And this other stuff though is like
so in the Yiga clan, for example,
yes, I forgot the Yiga.
Like, my favorite, this kind of traces of this sort of like non-state actor / splinter group quasi-libertarian weapons developer.
I was calling them like a combination of Yakuza, but just Japanese organized crime, and like Al Qaeda. But you were right. There's like something more happening.
Right. There's some kind of there's some attitude of toward technology that is in contrast to the scientific elite we have.
Yes.
In Pura and the lab research.
I mean, I will say this. This is really getting into deep cuts on theory, but like Pura and Robbie, like they're an Impa.
Yes, an Impa.
Are all interested in this lore and in this past and in this technologies. But they're like almost like perfect early moderns, in that they're interested in this very like Goethe way, this like holistic wonder. Like they're non-instrumentalists. They're not like doing back what many players do. Like one of the first things I heard talked about like on a podcast was people like automating a mining system such they could get like infinite zonite and things like that. And like,
Pura is like an Alexander Humboldt type.
Yes,
figure.
exactly. Like they're doing like early like Wissenschaft, like in the grand sense, right? Like they want to know the like wonders of the world. They're not really even thinking that instrumentally. They're like, even though like Robbie is sitting there with a fucking full scale goddamn hot air balloon. It like never occurs to him that he can use this for agriculture,
right?
Or like something like that, or he can use this to transport goods. He's just like, look at this crazy thing. Like, why?
Yeah.
How?
Look at all these pictures of plants that I can take.
Yeah, and I haven't gotten far enough in the plot, but the new like again another form in Kariko Village is a kind of. It's a non-hereditary chiefdom. It's right.
I think so.
Yeah, and the character who's now the chief was a younger girl in Breath of the Wild. Now she's middle-aged and is the chief. But she has, I don't know if you noticed this, up in her study, she has pictures of all the Zonai devices.
Yep.
But this is not because she wants to like build a fleet of airplanes or even conceives of that.
Right.
It's because she's trying to learn the language.
Yes. Yes. And meanwhile, there are certain like the Zonai constructs have schema stones, like blueprints for Zonai devices. But you have to be able to access. You need there's like a green access portal you get, in contrast to the Yiga clan ones, which are just like lying around on tables.
Yes. I mean, it's funny. I haven't gotten far enough with the other thing is I think this maybe should have been the first thing, but this game is very large.
It's very
especially
large.
Again, for something that's running on the chipset that the Switch is like a phone chipset it was a dated phone chipset already 7 years ago. And to me, this actually is a much bigger issue that maybe we won't even get to today, which is that like, you maybe don't need the power of PlayStation 5 or like a massive computer to make the games that actually not only are to me aesthetically the most interesting, but also are like wildly, insanely popular.
Yeah. The
other like sort of factoid I didn't share is that many of the early Zelda games didn't sell that well. They sold fine. But these last two, and this one in particular, I mean, we don't have all the numbers and stuff yet, but it sold 10 million copies in its first 3 days, making it one of the fastest selling games of all time, and certainly the fastest selling Zelda game of all time. Probably on mark to be massive. So like even by the ugly qualifications of the culture industry, this is a massive success. But it bucks the logic of that, like, more is better. Budget, the highest budget is the best thing. The most power, the most like pixels
the best frame
I can
rate.
throw at. Yeah. Oh my God, the best frame rate. Because there are whole sites, especially in games have a really weird tradition because like culture of games criticism doesn't grow out of like literary or art criticism the way that even technological arts like photography and cinema grow. It grows out of like consumer report style reviews of software, like the same places you would go to find out like how WordPerfect was different from Word is where you would go to find like how Infocom Spellbreaker was different from whatever. And like, I feel like that has always been a hangover in games. And thus there is this kind of like devotion often to like technical's not the right word. Purely additive quantitative achievement as opposed to sort of like creativity within constraint.
Yes.
And something that the game
and actually creativity
both is
with,
and performs is that.
I mean, as you say this, I think that like creativity within constraint has actually just been a through line through all of our episodes so far. Like whether we're talking about the early James Cameron films or
like Terminator.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like things that are produced intelligently with constraints of various sorts, whether technological or budgetary or whatever, tend to there's something that about those kinds of things that is such a good rebuke to so much of what is
yes, absolutely. Now. And especially the sort of like, I mean, it's funny. We joked about Oppenheimer, and we might talk about it again in an upcoming episode. But like one of the factoids I've seen floating around about that is like its IMAX version is so heavy and so big that it's like breaking plates and all this kind of stuff. And like it is the absolute, literally the absolute maximum amount of film you can do.
Yes.
Like using IMAX technology or whatever it is.
Yes. It's 11 miles of.
Whereas, I mean, Tears of the Kingdom is less than 16 gigabytes.
So crazy.
Which is, if you want a comparison.
Is that right?
Yes, because a Switch cartridge is never larger than 16 gigabytes. I think maybe a couple are 32.
Oh, shit. It is. Yeah, you're right. It's 16 gigabytes.
Yeah. If you want a comparison, I think the most recent Call of Duty is like 133 gigabytes or something like that. So, and again, that's like a 6-hour campaign plus an iterative and very complex multiplayer. So to be fair, but like, that's wild.
That's so crazy.
Yeah, it's absolutely actually fucking insane. And like that's, I think, that's not just like a fun fact for me as someone interested in like energy and like resources and all that stuff. It's also an interesting fact about the way that they're modeling creativity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
And the tension, right, it's funny because like I mentioned earlier, like the genre confusion. And I love this like idea of it as a playing Mourning. So Spiele Trau, but Trauerspiel, whatever. I can't. My German's not good enough to reverse it, right? Because like I can't remember. I said the thing before about like originally this game was built not on a mechanic but on a feeling, and that feeling is still present,
very much so.
And it's much more childlike in the early games. And now it's mature. And it's funny, I'm scare quoting mature to Izzy because the way in which mature is used in game discussion usually is actually adolescent.
Yes.
And I would actually counter, it's funny because you talk about it being family friendly in some ways. Adults and children play it alike, but it is actually mature in the sense that the like tension between a feeling of like wonder, whether it be like the flaneurs wonder, wandering around and getting distracted and being guided maybe not by the logic of dominant society.
Yep.
Or if it is the wonder that these characters have about this like lost past. It's being put into tension with this Mourning. That's mature. That's serious.
Yeah.
Like that is like neither of us have finished the game, right? I'm pretty sure that, everything ends up good in the end. But everything ending up good in the end of this, given the way it's set up, you are still in a place of loss.
Yes. And
I mean,
people-
it's telegraph, guys, in the title, Tears of the Kingdom.
and loss as an ordinary feature of life, right?
Yes, irreversible decline and loss. And again, this is not necessarily like good, right? This sounds like it could be Spengler or like, right? Who are the like theorists of the Schopenhauer? I don't know. There's all these classic theorists of decline. They tend to be quite right wing, you know. And then there's the more complex, like progress is always a regress thing. That's the sort of critical theory mainstay. But here, in fact, even if you like finish and you beat it and you win, like winning doesn't bring back.
Yes,
Speaking of this, our friend Walter Benjamin, in a letter Max Horkheimer once wrote to him, winning does not bring back the dead. Winning will not make those like robots less sad that they're just performing the empty echo of what was once useful labor. They're not even dead labor. They're like zombie labor.
Yes. Yeah. A feature that will not be affected in any way.
No, they're still going to be there, just like cranking out batteries for no one.
Yes. Right. And that's sad.
That's incredibly sad.
That's the kind of sadness that like when you're young and you experience that for the first time, it's like, oh, that's an anxiety
right. I was thinking, I was thinking about this again in relation to our conversation about Elden Ring, because that also is so melancholic and it's so vicious and cruel, and that's a different. But like this is actually in some ways much sadder. Like that kind of emptiness is much sadder than just cruelty, because it's like.
You see it play out among ordinary people. The fact that this kind of broader story is so interlaced with these ordinary lives.
Yeah.
Who go, like these people who kind of go about their days in the presence of that sadness. Like that's a profoundly.
That is so yes, as a player and as from the point of view of like someone like Link or like Zelda. Right. It is just profoundly sad. Although I guess for those people it's not, but that's also a feature of Trauerspiel is that like the ordinary folks have very little knowledge of what's going on, which is also quite reactionary.
Yes, that's a whole other set of. Anyway, yeah. Well, on that note, before we come to a conclusion, we received 2 questions from listeners on The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. The first inquiring about the class position of the Koroks in this world.
I believe it was suggested that they are petit bourgeois. I mean, the Koroks are so strange. Well, do you want to say anything? I have thoughts, but
right, the activity of camping in this world is a very kind of like,
I mean, there is a lot. I mean, the other thing we haven't even talked about how there's like an active weather system and stuff. Like level of systems on systems on systems in this game. Oh, that actually is a theoretical thing I wanted to bring up, which is that like it's very reminiscent of Mackenzie Wark wrote 2 books back in the day, one called The Hacker Manifesto and one called Gamer Theory. And both sort of gesture at this idea, especially gamer theory, that like this kind of like play of systems and systems and systems itself, like as you like run up against them in that kind of combinatorial bliss or whatever that I was describing earlier, like becomes a kind of like intuition about actually existing social structures and the way in which you both can and cannot break them, or how like it's almost like a mix of sort of it's a synthesis almost of like Marx and Foucault, right? Like how you can break them. Korok class position is hard.
Well, then okay, having just said that, right? I think if you're thinking about the ways that games kind of recalibrate how you experience sort of ordinary systems and ordinary structures, like there is something about Koroks as these sort of unexpected and delightful features of
it's almost, if I was going to choose like the bourgeois or the petit bourgeois of this world, it would be more the like there's so many wandering merchants.
Yes, like a sort of itinerant traveling troupe type or like magician type.
Also,
thing.
it should be pointed out that the economy of Hyrule just makes no fucking sense.
It makes no sense.
If you have an abundance of anything, any merchant will buy it for its going price, even if that is like 100,000 rupees.
That's correct.
Which doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
So I think that there are all these like, again, I keep wanting to use German for some reason, like bourgeois sort of people, right? There's the company president, the two company presidents. There are these traders and things like this. And some of these, like the company folks they're doing reinvestment. They're doing a version of capitalism. The Koroks have their own economy. There's so many different economies actually running in the game as well that all make no sense. Right? The Korok give you seeds and you can trade seeds with their king. It's sovereign debt. They issue sovereign debt.
Okay, yes. Let me put it that way.
They're financiers.
For arms. And it's for arms.
Yeah, they increase your inventory for your arms. Oh my God, it's sovereign debt issued for military expansion.
This is what I was saying.
This is turned out to be a great question.
Thank you to the tweeter who asked.
Yes. And what was the other one?
For their king, who's also like kind of a mad king.
Yeah, their king, but like a mad king in a fun way, not in like a Richard III kind of way.
Right. He has a little dance.
Yeah, with his maracas, and like there's some kind of like, again, the comedy is so pratfally. It's so like Marx Brothers, right?
Yeah.
Like there's little, it's not quite fireworks, but there's like confetti that shoots up behind him. And like, it's just so charming.
Yes.
Even within this, again, overall landscape of like, oh, it's quite desolate and like literally the earth is like eating everyone alive.
But also spitting monsters back up at you after they die.
Yes. And we didn't even talk about the I think the scariest thing, again, it's weirdly, there was apparently very little. Elden Ring and this were developed at the same time. So
the gloom hands?
Yeah, but both of them have the scary hands, and the gloom hands are incredibly scary.
They're very scary.
Did you ever beat one and see what? Yeah. So it turns into a phantom form of Ganon.
Yeah. Very spooky.
The second question was from a listener who wanted to know
the mining.
About the mining. Yes. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something first? I definitely have lots of thoughts on extractivism.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the really striking things about the presence of zononite, this substance that you can mine.
Yes.
Sorry, zonite.
There's so many things you mine, right?
But you're really like mining it underground from ore. Is that there isn't a lot of it left.
Oh, I never even...
Or like these mines are all abandoned, right? Underground.
But it's funny because the zonite respawns every 3-day cycle, I think.
It does, but it's like, it's sparse. It's not everywhere. It's like sort of sparse.
When you first clear out one of these abandoned mines, it's much more prolific. But then the second time, it will then still recreate some low level of zonite every time you go back. Otherwise, the game would stop working.
But I mean, and more to the point about kind of the abandoned mines, right?
Yes.
These are all, you get a sense of sort of something having gone terribly wrong here.
Oh, that's where you were getting. So like something that you got and that I totally missed is that there is this implication that the Zonai did themselves in.
Yeah.
And maybe the Sheikah did as well.
Reading. That's how I read it.
I mean, maybe it's that Ganon did. I actually don't know even as someone who does really love this series and is like wearing the t-shirt right now, I actually don't know if there's like a lore answer for this. I actually don't care.
Yeah.
Because I like, if that's the hermeneutic that you landed on, it makes the most sense. And it makes the sense with this being a decline or a mourning story, right? That like, oh, they did themselves in.
Right.
They went
just like the submarine guy.
Just like the submarine. Yeah. I mean, it's weird because they are presented as like.
Are you okay, Elliot?
Yeah, Elliot. No, I was thinking because like, is Rauru meant to be a Zonai? I have no idea. But you are presented with like some some idea that these were like wise people, but still they got totally fucked.
Yeah.
And this again is echoes of the Mahabharata and things like that for me. But like, yes, like it's a game. So there is like Zonite essentially becomes an infinitely renewable resource, at least for Link.
Right.
And there is like an ugly, weird thing about. So the other thing, there is a sort of not generic, that's not the right word. There is a version of environmental critique that exists in this, I think, that is very close to a form of like conservationism that's has like a romantic tinge, or like the pristine nature versus its pollution, etc. And actually the text that I most associate, or the texts that I most associate with this when thinking about this kind of creation is Hayao Miyazaki's films, in particular Princess Mononoke, which has, although I believe the game designers claim there's no connection, I don't believe them. I also just don't trust creators when they say everything. Some things I trust, like when they're talking about like triangles and shit like that, I trust. But like, you know, I never was influenced by this thing. It's just such a claim, right? But like, if you look at a lot of side by side, like image capture, like look at like frames from Princess Mononoke and look at frames from Tears of the Kingdom, and you'll notice extremely similar tropes. So for example, the gloom in Tears of the Kingdom looks exactly like the pollution in Princess Mononoke. Link's sort of infected, weird, he loses his arm. By the way, we haven't even fucking talked about it. In the first 5 minutes of the fucking game, he loses a limb.
Yes.
And it's replaced with like a eerily, clearly not human limb.
Yes.
Yeah. Like,
it's dark.
Yeah, it's some fucked up shit. And all, but again, if you've seen Princess Mononoke, that is in fact that like one of the lead characters is exactly that, right? Like is like this sort of like noble soul who has been infected with this pollution. Now, that can maybe sound nice from an environmental perspective. I always find that kind of approach to thinking about the nature and ecology to be somewhat limited, although very productive in terms of aesthetic beauty. Like a lot of really wonderful aesthetic objects have been created out of this. That doesn't like dissipate the political problem. I often find, in fact, like problematic social and political tensions are very productive for good aesthetic work.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And for thinking about the ways that we understand sort of discourses around the climate, or like,
yes,
is a way of kind of forcing us to reflect on how like environmentalism gets, you know, narrativized in certain ways, or like certain kinds of sort of imaginaries and tropes kind of emerge from these discourse that are often kind of brought to the fore in these games.
Yeah. In these games or in other works of art. And in fact, this is actually a really, to me at least, leads to a possible point of conclusion, which is while so many of the storytelling elements are so important and help achieve this kind of like affective tension and its aesthetic beauty, what we are actually like, I don't look to the story elements or the quote unquote content as its most, if I'm looking for the like socially generative stuff, it's actually the weirdest, the stuff we started with. It's like the playing off of math and art, the playing off of possibility and, you know, execution and all these kinds of things that seem fairly quote unquote apolitical are formally the most interesting if I want to start being generative.
Yes.
In the way that I mentioned those work texts, right?
Yes.
They're generative about social thinking.
Yes.
Because they are thinking formally about game structure, as opposed to just being like, oh, it's a story about a dude who needs a fancy sword to save a princess.
Yes. Yes. What is it? The phrase that Susan Buck-Morss uses that I really like, the utopian surplus, right?
That's a great.
Yeah. This was in the context of specifically kind of visionary architecture, but like the kinds of cultural objects that are capable of producing, that sort of aren't meant to be realizable, but kind of produce this other thing, which is this utopian surplus that allows us to, for a moment's kind of glimpse, different kinds of possibilities.
Exactly. And I think that happens, you know, it's, again, weird still to this day to sort of jump register. But I do think that that is what happens in a successful game like this. And it's funny. I actually had a Buck Morris thing from Graham Kirkpatrick's aesthetic theory in the video game. And it actually speaks to this exact point, right? There's a kind of like, he talks in this long analysis of Badiou and Benjamin and then Buck Morris about the tension between play and work and between artifice and nature and all this stuff, and basically illusion and reality. And it concludes by saying these tensions give the work its charge. And it is this power that can be used in political aesthetic interventions to lay what Benjamin thinks of as cultural depth charges with power to illuminate the present and show us different ways forward. And that's like exactly it to me. I mean, I love this book. I think I've cited it before. But that's one, you know, this is also the book talking about gameplay as like dance, which I don't think applies here as much. But right, like those tensions and the way you play them out, even in the most comedic way, right? That's where the social commentary lies. Even though I was also troubled by the way that you like, it's like a perfect game design loop that they have, right? You have to go to get to the sky to get certain things that help you in the underworld, and then you mine them for the things you use in the overworld. And it makes a certain kind of game logic, but it is disturbing that you are essentially constantly engaged in a kind of extractivism. And at least one of the four main people, the Gorons, that seems to be their whole life, is basically that plus like some cooking. We didn't even talk about how they're addicted to like some form of crack, essentially.
Yeah. No, sorry. I just remembered that I'm thinking that the phrase utopian surplus might come from Block.
It sounds like Block. It's funny because Block comes up in both the texts I was reading earlier. I think it's Block,
and I think I was reading Susan Buck Morse on Block. Yeah.
But either way, it doesn't really matter because like that's where it's at. Right. And if there's like a utopia, like Hyrule's not a fucking utopia,
no.
But the aesthetic experience of those systems playing off each other and producing unexpected qualities for you and for the artist, right? The creator. That's utopian.
Yeah.
And that it's done within such constraint and such limit. That's utopian.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And with that, I think that's a really lovely place to end. Ajay, this was lovely.
Izzy, it was also very fun. And nice to be back in the podcasting saddle.
I know. I've had many a student have asked, where?
Where's the next?
Yeah. And we will be back soon, I hope.
I think next month.
Yeah, to discuss
something.
Probably all manner of terrible summer blockbusters.
Yeah, I imagine it's movies. On the doc, there's a lot of possibilities. If you have suggestions, please send them in.
Absolutely.
Or questions or comments. I am sure I fucked up 800 mini facts of Zelda lore. So if you want to rake me over the coals, go for it. But yeah, we have a long list of movies and of television shows, and our colleague Joseph is going to Evo, the big fighting tournament competition. So we have a lot of material to work with.
Yes. Okay.
And on that note, have a great evening, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Elliot, our wonderful AV technician. As ever. And
once again, if you want to support us, you can head on over to Patreon. You find that link on the Brooklyn Institute website or at patreon.com/thepodcast for social research or podcast for one of those two. Please do. And we'll see you very soon.
Bye. Yeah.
Yeah.